Here's the thing about composition. It's incredibly simple on the surface, but it is equally nuanced and equally significant. You've got this busy scene with a whole lot going on, plenty to look at, but one part of it is most important. You know what that is, but your viewer doesn't. Composition is how you communicate that to them. It's how you show them where to look and tell them what's important in the frame and in the story. It's the mechanics of visual storytelling. My name is Aidin Robbins, I'm a filmmaker, and in this video, I want to walk you through the basics of composition so you can communicate with your audience and tell better stories. Let's start out with types of shots. There are a few kind of fundamental ways to frame a scene. First, you have a wide shot, which shows the entire scene. This can be great for placing a subject within the context of their environment, or it can act as an establishing shot. An establishing shot is usually the first shot of a scene or film, setting up the location. Punch in a bit and you have a medium shot. This shows a subject from the torso up. It's the most common way to frame a human subject because it feels natural. It mimics the way that we see people in a conversation. Punch in even more and you have a close-up, which shows the subject from the shoulders up or allows a single object to fill the frame. This can draw attention to expressions and facial cues on a character or highlight the importance of a specific object in the scene. There are other types of shots as well, like an extreme close-up or a medium close-up that frame shots differently, but those three are kind of the fundamental basics to understand. Now, take the camera and tilt it a bit and you have camera angles. And once again, there are a couple basics. The two camera angles that you hear talked about the most frequently are a low angle and a high angle. At a low angle, the camera is below the subject looking up at it, and at a high angle, the camera is above the subject looking down at it. This can imply like the power dynamic in a conversational scene. If the camera is looking up at one character and down at another, then you know who holds the power in that interaction. And it can also be used to frame a single subject. If the camera is looking down at a character while they're walking dejectedly through a rainy street, then it's pretty easy to infer that that character is not doing the best at that point in the story. There are other camera angles you see used less frequently and usually as more of a creative statement, like a Dutch angle where the camera is tilted on its side. You see this a lot in like horror movies and thrillers because it implies tension and unease. And you also have a bird's eye or overhead shot, which looks straight down at the scene. Think like Wes Anderson. You'll see a lot of these in his movies. They show the scene in a very interesting way, kind of laying out the geography of a scene. All right, shot types and camera angles, both very like overall broad fundamental ideas. Let's punch in a bit and talk a bit more about the micro of composition, starting out with the rule of thirds. You've probably heard this term tossed around before. It's just a technique for composing shots so that they feel natural and balanced. So take your shot and divide it into thirds both horizontally and vertically. Your subject should be placed either dead center or on the intersection of two lines. That allows for a comfortable balance between the subject and the rest of the frame. If the subject is a little off center or too close to the edge of the frame, then the shot feels a little off. The rule of thirds also applies to horizon lines, which are typically best placed along one of the horizontal lines rather than dead center. Tools like the rule of thirds help your subject to fit naturally into the frame, but it's also important that your viewer is actually able to find that subject. And that's where tools like leading lines come in. These are just lines that guide the viewer's eye through the frame, ideally leading back to the subject of the shot. The most dramatic example is several lines that converge right on the subject. Think of like a shot down a hallway or a train track, but there are also more subtle examples, like you can probably find a few in this shot. Another not so subtle way to draw the eye to the subject is a technique called subframing, where you place the subject of the shot within a frame in the frame, like a door frame or a window. Subframing can imply isolation or entrapment by visually separating the subject from the world around them, or if it happens close to the camera, that it can imply that the subject is being watched from afar. All the techniques we've talked about so far are helpful for framing an object within the shot, but it's also important to consider the relationship between multiple objects in a shot. By placing one subject higher in the frame than another, you imply that that subject has greater power or significance within the scene. The same goes for having one object appear larger in the frame than another. It's kind of a similar visual technique to using high angles and low angles, just it happens within one shot. And a lot of the time you'll see crossover between these techniques, like a Dutch angle being used to tilt the camera and make one subject appear higher in the frame than another. And finally, on perhaps its most basic level, composition includes what you choose to show and omit from the frame. When you're setting up a shot, keep an eye out for distracting elements that can pull the focus away from the subject and clutter the frame, particularly around the edges of the shot. You can move the camera around and change the composition in order to eliminate those elements and clean the shot up, especially in a location where you might not necessarily have full control to move things out of the shot. And finally, since this video is a lot of rules, I want to remind you that none of them are actually rules. You don't have to follow them in order to have a good shot or make a good film. Again, composition is central to the visual language of film, so it's incredibly important to understand how the mechanics work, but oftentimes creativity starts with knowing a rule and deciding not to follow it. So don't always follow the rules. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this one, learned something new from it. If you did, be sure to subscribe to Adorama TV for more videos just like this one, and if you're feeling crazy, you can even subscribe to me. You didn't hear that from me, but I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time.